a little suffering for Christ's sake. When I am getting through a hedge, if my head and shoulders are safely through, I can bear the pricking of my legs. Let us rejoice in the remembrance that our holy head has surmounted all his sufferings and triumphed over death. Let us follow him patiently. We shall soon be partakers of his victory. Amen. 5 years later, he was a partaker of Christ's victory. And this morning, I echo what Charles Simeon said. Brothers, we must not mind a little suffering. We must not mind a little suffering. If you could say that there was one spiritual grace that could be mentioned about my generation, the generation before, and the generation after, the one coming, that would describe this, it could be a lot of things, but I am pretty sure it would not be perseverance and endurance. I'm not saying there's no exceptions and that godly men and women who do persevere, there are no people who do persevere through trials. I'm just talking about as a whole, this generation, the ones previous, my generation, the one after, have not really learned endurance and perseverance. In fact, we have learned, as a sign of our times, as the children of our age, to give up. That's what we've learned. We've learned to give up. In our day, endurance is not rewarded, but rather retreat is. A constant sign of our times is emotional frailty. We get easily offended. We get easily hurt. We are the kids who pout and complain about unfairness and our rights. We break way too easily. Our marriages break easily. The average percentage of marriages that end in divorce is over 50%. And you would think that number would change among Christians, but it doesn't. It's still around 50%. In fact, today the world has what they call starter marriages. The first one's going to fail anyway, so you might as well just plan for it and just get a good idea what a marriage is like. Planning to fail, planning to give up. This is our age. Our commitment to relationships is thin at best. And when we are slighted in any way, we're quick to defend and go on the attack, willing to absolve years of good relationship because of one idle word or deed. This is our generation. Let's just take an honest look at it this morning, okay? Church commitment is at an all-time high. No. Church commitment's at an all-time low. People flit from one to the next and to the next, wherever they can go to find a place where they can either be entertained or feel the comforts of home. Rarely do we go to a church anticipating and hoping that the sermons and the teaching will make us uncomfortable. Instead, we look for some place that will make us comfortable when we should be looking for a place that makes us uncomfortable. Something that will challenge us. We don't want to be challenged. We don't want to be challenged. By the way, if you don't think that this is a result of this generation, observe the children being raised in this generation. I work in a Christian school. Although it is a Christian school, it is a school with kids. And endurance and trials, challenged, is not something that is thought of as important. A pastor in Minneapolis named John Piper said this: a typical emotional response to trouble in the church, he's talking to pastors when he says this, is to think, well, if that's the way they feel about me, then they can find themselves another pastor. I cringe because I've thought those very same thoughts before. I'm sorry if my candor offends you this morning. And no doubt members of this church have thought the same thing regarding me, or other pastors, or one another. Somebody doesn't like them. I'll just find a church where I'm liked. In other words, when historians reflect on the values of the 20th and 21st century in Christianity in America, it is doubtful they will list constancy, endurance, patience, resolve, commitment as the qualities. Instead, they'll probably list self-realization, self-aggrandizing, self-motivation, self-assertiveness. It's probably what will be listed. Satan knows our times, and he wants us to be the children of our times and just plain give up. Charles Simeon life and the biblical truths that he exemplifies in Psalm 71 is an illustration this morning. As Hebrews says, someone we can look to see that someone who made it. And to encourage you this morning, whatever the pain in your soul, don't give up. Don't give in. Charles Simeon grew up in a wealthy home of an unbeliever. At 19 years old, of an unbeliever. His parents were not Christians. At 19 years old, he attended Cambridge University. Believe it or not, Cambridge University was a godless environment, although religious. After Simeon was saved, gloriously saved, it took him 3 months to find another Christian in the entire campus, and this was supposed to be a religious school. It's interesting how he got saved. 19 years old, not having any spiritual background, never went to church. His church, it was in the Anglican religion, and in those days, many of the Anglicans were very corrupt in the sense that it was a position to have, to be an Anglican bishop or pastor. So his dad was actually pushing for that because it would make him wealthier. But it bothered Simeon because he was told that he was to go and attend a communion service at Trinity Church at Cambridge. And although he was an ungodly man, a young man, and he didn't know much about it, he just knew there was something wrong with partaking in this communion service. He didn't feel right about it. So he got some books that he found. He started reading, and he tried very hard to repent of his sins and be a better person, and he just had no peace. He just was scared to eat of it. He tried, and he went, and nothing happened at that communion service. He could not make himself better. But then it kept coming around. There was going to be another communion service, and it bothered him. He knew he could not eat worthily of this communion. So he found a book about the Lord's Supper, and as Easter approached, he understood something in reading this book about the Passover, that the Jews knew what they were doing when they placed their hand on the head of the animal and transferring their guilt to another. He said this is his own words, "The thought came to my mind, what? May I transfer all my guilt to another? Has God provided an offering for me that I may lay my sins on his instead?" At that point, Charles Simeon realized that it was Jesus Christ that he could lay his sins upon. He laid his sin and guilt on Jesus Christ, and the blinders came off, and the guilt was gone, and he reports that Easter Sunday he rejoicingly partook of the Lord's Supper and was excited, and he was a born-again man. Amen. Because he laid his sins on Jesus Christ. And the change was drastic in his life. He refused money that people were trying to send him because he had one focus, one mind. His family was rich, and he refused their money because he said, "No, I must be busy serving God." He witnessed to his family. His father did not like it at all. His father never believed, but his brothers got saved. He was called to Trinity Church, the Anglican church in the center of Cambridge University, and he pastored there for 54 years until he died. He never got married. He refused to get married because he believed it would limit his opportunities at the university to witness. And so he refused that right, that privilege that God gives us. What is remarkable to me in his constancy, though, is the struggles, personally, ecclesiastically, and positionally that he had. Let me just explain some of these struggles. He was appointed the pastor of Trinity Church in 1782, and he was delighted to be the pastor. But the Anglican church is a little different than ours. They appointed their pastors by a man from the outside. He was appointed, and nobody in the church wanted him to be pastor. They wanted the assistant that was already there to be pastor. When Simeon realized this, he backed off and said, "I will not be pastor there." The person who appointed him said, "Well, I'm not going to appoint him anyways." So he realized they would have no pastor, so he took the pastorate. Now you say, okay, well, they eventually warmed up to him. The congregation had the choice as to who was to preach in this Sunday afternoon message sermons, like our Sunday evening sermons. For 5 years, they refused to let Simeon preach in that sermon. He's the pastor. They refused to let him preach, and instead they had the assistant preach instead. Well, that assistant left, so now Simeon would get to preach. No, they got a completely unrelated independent man they didn't even know to come and preach in that afternoon service for another 7 years, rather than let him preach. And you read I've read some of the sermons of Simeon. He was a good preacher. It wasn't that he was a bad preacher or anything. They just didn't want him in the first place, and so they didn't care. For 12 years, he was not allowed to preach on a Sunday afternoon in his own church. That was just the beginning. Simeon tried to start an evening service. He tried to start an evening service and invite the people from the community to come to hear the gospel. Those that were in charge of the buildings, kind of like deacons today, they locked the doors so people would have to wait in the streets. So he couldn't have an evening service. Well, he got around that. Eventually they decided to unlock the door, especially because there was a court order that was issued down that was illegal for them to do so. By the way, Simeon refused to honor that. He refused to even bring that up, even though the court order was issued. He just trusted that God would take care of it. That old church, they had buildings, and I don't know if you've ever seen these old churches, but they have little pews with little